Australian Calabresi Cultural Association edition of the program Sono Calabresi, which comprises a conversation with members of our community about their experience and life in Australia. The aim of the program is to enable us to share the varied experiences of members of our community in order to demonstrate the positive contribution that's been made by the Calabresi to the broader community and thereby dispel the negative media image. So far, we've had a chef, an engineer and a logistics operator. Tonight's guest is a politician. His name is John Pesutto, who until the last election was the state's Attorney General. He lost his seat in that election, but I'm sure that the fire still burns and he will be entering Parliament at the next state elections. Before welcoming John, though, I need to make it perfectly clear that our association does not support any particular party in politics, but we do support the efforts of any Calabresi to participate in the political process. So if there's any aspiring politician on either side who would like to participate in the program, we're only too pleased to have him join us for a conversation and tell us about himself. As I said, tonight's guest is the former Attorney General for the state of Victoria, and his name is John Pesutto. John, welcome and thank you for taking the time to have a chat with us. I know that while you're out of Parliament, you're still very busy, and we appreciate the opportunity to have a chat with you.
Oh, Vincent, prego. It's my great honour to be one of the interviewees, and one of the great laments I have about COVID-19 is that we haven't been able to catch up as often as we might have. But it's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Yeah, indeed. Now, John, I understand you were born in Australia.
That's right.
Whereabouts?
So in the Latrobe Valley in Gippsland, in Traralgon to be particular.
Traralgon?
Yeah,
lovely
Traralgon.
town.
So one of 5 kids.
Yeah.
Dad worked on the power stations down there, and Mum, housewife for most of our young years, but then worked in a shoe factory. So worked very hard and instilled all the values that I know your parents and mine instilled in us as a generation.
So your parents, came from Calabria to Australia?
That's right.
Yeah, whereabouts in Calabria?
Yeah, so Dad was born and grew up in a little village not far from Catanzaro.
Right.
Pesutto Seralto,
Mm-hmm.
a beautiful little village. I've only been there once, but I'd love to make it back there at some point in the future. And Mum grew up in Catanzaro proper. So, they grew up as childhood sweethearts, as it were.
Yeah. And do you know how old they were when they migrated?
Yeah, so Dad came out in 1961. So he was 26.
Right.
And Mum came out a couple of years later. They married 9 days after that in 1963.
Right. So all the children were Australian born then, I take it. And
that's right.
And do you know why Dad settled in the Latrobe Valley rather than in Melbourne? Was it work or family or a combination?
Paysan, basically. So there were a few Paysan living in and around the Latrobe Valley. So they were able to talk to him about getting possible work. Back in those days, that whole generation of migrants, how many jobs did they work? 4 or 5 at once? I don't know how they did it, but they worked their guts out. So he had Paysan down here. Yeah. It was a typical story of adventure, but also tragedy, because so many families were broken up. My dad, as with my mum, were also each of 5 in their own families. So his siblings went all various ways. He had a couple of brothers who went to the United States and New York in particular. One of his younger brothers stayed in Italy for a little while longer, but then eventually came out and joined Dad here. And his sister is and remains in Catanzaro. So he came out on his own, but had Paysan he could relate to.
Good. And did they ever discuss with you the reasons why they left Calabria?
Yeah, many times. And it's just such a sad thing in a way, but also, positive in that we can sit here talking about it. with great romantic memories of the adventures they took. But opportunities. There were very few opportunities, particularly in the south of Italy. So a lot of us know this through our ancestors and those of us who grew up and spent a bit of time in Catanzaro, but the opportunities were few and far between, and they took huge chances. I mean, you think about it now, imagine you just packed up and thought, I'm going to go to a country, I don't know the language, I don't know much about this country other than I've heard people going there and they say it's okay. I'm going to go. So for my dad, it was hard. For my mum, it was even harder. So, yeah.
And it's sad that a lot of young people are still leaving Calabria for the same reason. I mean, the chef that we interviewed some weeks ago, he's a relatively young man. He's only been here 6 or 7 years, but he left for the same reason, a lack of opportunity. And it's really a shame. And again, the statistic is that there's 7 million outside Calabria and 2 million inside Calabria.
That would be about right.
In Calabresi. Now, in terms of education, you obviously went to the local schools. Whereabouts?
Yeah, so the local primary school was St. Michael's in Traralgon, and then went to St. Paul's. So they were relatively small, low fee paying Catholic schools, but good schools. And for the area, you know, they provided a sound education and good values that my mum and dad were keen to instill in us. So I just remember my years at school being, very, very enjoyable and memorable.
And you must have done well because you went to Melbourne University to study law.
Well, that's right. So I think I can't particularly pinpoint the time, Vince, but I think it was sometime in around year 9, 1985, maybe early year 10, 1986, that I just struck up this deep and abiding interest in history and politics, and I just knew that's where I wanted to spend my professional life once I grew up and graduated, whatever I was doing. So I was determined from about that age to study law, commerce if I could. And the reason I stumbled on that, well, not really stumbled, I made that decision is that reading about so many successful politicians, I knew it wasn't a formal prerequisite, but studying history, as far back as Plato and Cicero and then more modern leaders like the Roosevelts, the Menzies, towering figures in their own countries, in their own time, they had all had some training in the law, in argument, in theory, in dialectics. And throughout history, that's always been the case. It doesn't mean that you have to do that to be a successful political leader, but certainly from my formative years, I wanted the law to be a grounding for me. And for my style of political participation, political leadership, my engagement with people is very much informed by my legal training and the way I develop arguments. And I know you would too. You're an outstanding lawyer, very distinguished. You would know what I mean when I say that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that it was really a very early decision that you made in terms of what career path you wanted to follow and in terms of education. Now, I would assume that, did your parents encourage you in pursuing that goal, or did they say, look, go out and into commerce, make money and all the rest of it?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely.
Yeah.
And like a lot of migrant parents, they wanted you to do what circumstance had denied them in many ways. They, like a lot of our parents, were just a source of encouragement and inspiration. And I was always conscious as a kid growing up about the sacrifices they were making. And I'm not alone. You would have seen that perhaps in your own upbringing. Dad and mum at different times working different jobs. I remember my dad on a couple of occasions in the 80s being made redundant from his work at the power stations. And as one particular occasion, I can often recall where, he'd come home and we were playing cricket in the driveway and he hopped out of his car and I knew something was wrong, but I didn't quite understand why. And I eventually found out from mum later, as we all did, us siblings, that dad had lost his job. But he just went out looking for work the next day and he was going everywhere looking for work because there was some dignity in being able to support your family. And that ethic of effort of not wasting and not expecting charity when you don't need it, when you are able-bodied, when you are capable. That drive just runs through my veins. And I look back at my parents and I just think you could have been in politics just as easily as me, but you know, they owe it to me. I'll tell you, if I've got a moment, a funny story that I often relate, but I call it the story about the chair. So when I was in late year 11 and I knew I had to pick up my game, because from my school, I didn't know of anybody who'd ever gone into law school. So I was pitching into the black. I didn't know what I was up against. I just knew I had to work like anything to get into Melbourne Law School, which is the school I wanted to go to ultimately. And I remember I was studying in my room and I had this old chair, and I mentioned to mum or dad that, you know, I think I need a better chair to study, and I'm going to be spending so much time over the next sort of 12 months. So they went out and spent what was in late 1987, early 98, the week's wages. A family of 5 kids. So I knew at that time what a sacrifice that was. And they went and bought me this swivel chair from the local office supplies store. It was an orange swivel chair. But boy, did I love that chair. And I did the typical migrant thing. I covered it with a fabric, so I wasn't actually sitting on it. But I tell you that, Vince, because when you ask, were they the source of it? They didn't quite understand the texts I had to familiarize myself with, the study I had to go through. All they knew is, how could we help our boy? And whatever we have to do, we'll do. And so they did it. And that's why I'm proud of them as parents.
And also, in a way, the stress to perform was yours internally rather than imposed by them externally. Other than, you know, you've got to do well. They're not, as I assume, they're not always getting into your head saying you've got to do well, because you obviously knew how well you had to do in order to advance. But interestingly, in terms of the decision to go into politics, were there many Italians in the area who were active in politics as you were growing up in the Latrobe Valley, or was this something internal to you or personal to you?
There weren't.
No.
There weren't. And part of the challenge, and at times I really asked myself in my year 12 year, 1988, when this was the first big test of, could I crack the marks to get in? There were so many mountains I felt I had to overcome. I was coming from a small country school where not many people certainly none that I knew of. I knew there would have been, but none that I could recall in the years before me had ever gone into law school. I think one had gone into medicine 5 or 6 years before me. So I had that, where I was competing with the best schools in the country in Melbourne and some parts of regional Victoria. So I knew I had that. I knew I had a family where we were always well looked after, but we didn't have great means like other people could. So I was facing that. Also, back in those days, the idea of going into politics as a first generation Australian wasn't a common thing. There were trailblazers, of course, but in my area there weren't many. I can't recall any back then. Yeah. So there was this sense of, I'm on my own here to try and make this. And I had a great parents and a great family behind me, and teachers knew I wanted it, so they were supportive too. But there wasn't a lot of precedent around. I couldn't look to many people and say, I want to do what he did or she did. It was a first time thing for me.
Yeah. And you're a little modest, because in fact you were the dux of your school, weren't you?
Yeah.
And you won a number of prizes, including the Bishop's Prize for General Excellence. And
it was a great night.
And
that
there
presentation
was the academic prize in politics, economics, mathematics, and chemistry. So you must have been a pretty hard worker and dedicated to the task. And then you got into law school at Melbourne. Did that entail you having to leave Traralgon and come to Melbourne and live on your own, or how did you manage that?
Yeah, so it did, and it was tough on my parents. But I'd had a couple of siblings who'd moved to Melbourne to pursue educational other opportunities, so I wasn't the first to leave the nest. But it did mean moving away, and I perhaps like you and everyone watching, come from a very close family. So it wasn't easy, but it was exciting to move.
And where did you live? In one of the colleges or?
In Kew initially with an older brother who was already studying down here, and we moved around from apartment to apartment as you did back in those days. This was the late 80s, early 90s, and I pretty much stayed around Burundara, Hawthorn, Camberwell, Kew.
And so you graduated from law school, but even whilst at law school, you were still working, were you not?
Yeah, I had a few jobs from working in a couple of bottle shops, but I did pursue the sort of political longings. So I did some time at the Business Council of Australia working on labour market reform. This was back in the early 90s. And I also started to do some volunteer political work. So I went back to my hometown to volunteer for the local Liberal member, as he then was, back in the very early 90s. So I started to develop that sort of external experience in politics, not just studying it and writing about it at university.
Yeah. And did you practice as a lawyer? And what, with firms or on your own, or?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. In my final year, I decided I wanted to go back to my hometown as a graduated lawyer and run for office. So I was 23 at the time. So I felt I need a firm to go and work at. So I undertook articles at a small firm in Traralgon called Littleton Hackford. And so while I was down there in my first year, 1994, I put my hand up for pre-selection for the then Labor seat, but as a Liberal, running as the Liberal candidate in the seat of Macmillan. And that was a marginal Labor seat, and everybody in the party, I joined the party by that stage, felt that it was ripe for winning back in the what would then become the 1996 election. Now, I came second in that to Russell Broadbent, who to this day is still the member for Macmillan. But I went back and did 2 years of practice all about running for office. So I did it as a job that could support me when I finally ran.
Oh, good. And I understand you also worked for relatively large firms, Phillips Fox, and as a lawyer, as a solicitor, doing appearance work as well.
Yeah. So I often used to run my cases as often as I could. So I enjoyed the sort of, what would you call it, that liminal space between the bar and being a solicitor. So I didn't want to be just one or the other. So although I was strictly a solicitor, I liked running my own cases.
Yeah. And eventually you became an advisor to Ted Baillieu.
That was a great opportunity. Yeah, that was a great opportunity. That was in 2011. So in my legal practice, I'd run for office a few times and not quite got there, but I'd spent my time in legal practice developing a specialty in the area of industrial relations and labour law. So when Ted won the 2010 election, I went to his office as senior advisor on industrial relations. So that was a great opportunity to work at close quarters with the Premier, with the team. And I was part of, obviously, a large team of people working with departments and the like. And it was a great experience.
Yeah. And just explain to people who are watching, what does an advisor do? Because we hear often, advisor to this minister, advisor to that minister. What's the role of the advisor within the system, within the political system?
It is pretty much and essentially to advise. Not everyone does it as well as they should. They can get distracted on all sorts of internal political things. But the job of an advisor, particularly a senior advisor, and I was one of them, and eventually I'd become legal counsel to Premier Napthine once Ted left. But the job of an advisor is to give sound counsel to the Premier and to other ministers. So you'll often do that verbally, but sometimes you'll be having to commit your ideas to writing, and it's a very big responsibility, because what you've got to do is you've got to take a very complex issue, perhaps over an industrial relations issue, as in my case, or later when I was legal counsel on all manner of complex legal issues, and you've got to be able to provide a very busy political leader, head of government, with advice that is crisp and precise. So you would know what it's like if you had to condense a very difficult problem into one page. And that's what I used to do as a discipline. I would keep my memoranda to one page. It's Premier, this is what you need to know. This is the issue. In a couple of lines, these people are for it, these people are against it. This is what I recommend you do. And in 1 or 2 sentences, why? Churchill said, if you want me to prepare an hour-long speech, I'll need, such and such time. If you want me to give a 5-minute speech, I'll give, 5 times as long as that I'll need to prepare. And there's truth in that. To be able to synthesize very complex issues, you need to understand them, because what you put on that small sheet of paper better be right, because there's nowhere else to go. It's that one page. So when you ask, what does an advisor do? That's what an advisor should do. That's what most do. Well, not everyone might do that ultimately, but that's certainly the standard I tried to work up to.
It's interesting though, isn't it? Because in our system of government, historically and theoretically, the minister should rely on the head of his department to be given impartial advice on any of the issues that he comes across his desk. But we've sort of intermingled with that system, the American system of having advisors who are not elected but appointed by the minister. And some might say that the advisor acts as a buffer between the minister and everybody else. Is that part of the role of the minister, of the advisor, or not, do you think?
Yeah, there's some truth to that, Vince. And our system has evolved a bit. And I think what we've essentially got today in our system of government is you have almost 2 branches of the executive, in my view. You've got what I call the traditional non-partisan, I put that in inverted commas, non-partisan branch of the executive, which is the departments and agencies of government. They are the bodies which have tenure. They are there ostensibly to serve governments of the day, despite changes of government at elections. Whereas what I call the more, if you like, partisan or less or non-bureaucratic branch of the executive, which is essentially ministers, because ministers aren't non-partisan. Let's be frank. Ministers are drawn from the parliament. They are members of a political party, usually, almost entirely. They are political, and they're entitled to be. That's what responsible government in our constitutional system denotes. You have staff around them, because I just don't think it is possible today for a minister to have time to do justice to every brief that will come in. So, for example, Vince, you'll often get a brief from a department which typically is non-partisan. It gives you the options. It says these are the reasons for a particular decision. These are the reasons against it. These are your other options. Blah blah blah. To put a political overlay on that, the minister could do it if she or he had the time. But so much material comes before a minister. It's just not realistic to think that they can do that. So we are extensions. When we are senior advisors, in that time that I did, you are there to do what the minister would do herself or himself had they the time.
And you mentioned that you ultimately became the legal counsel to the Premier in that time. What was there any difference between your role as an advisor and your role as the legal counsel?
Essentially, you could say no, but I certainly regarded there as being a difference. As a senior advisor, you took your role, you backed all of your advice, you had to stand it up. Of course, you did all of that.
Yeah.
Because I'd been a lawyer over many years, I just took all of the solemn duties that attach to being a lawyer, right? So when I was giving advice, I would approach it as a lawyer. And you might say, well, what difference is it whether you're an advisor or a lawyer? I was no less a lawyer when I was senior advisor on industrial relations, but I wasn't employed at that time as a lawyer. When I was legal counsel, I was that position. So I exercised all of my functions when I did that, bearing that I owed duty as a lawyer to the Premier, obviously as an officer of the court, but I certainly took those duties a bit slightly differently.
And now you mentioned you had an ambition to enter politics from an early age, and you mentioned that you had a number of tries. Take it you're referring to pre-selection?
Certainly 3 goes at pre-selection and 1 in a general election, which was always going to be a bit tough to win. But I'd had about 4 goes before I finally had the chance to put my hand up for Hawthorn when Ted Baillieu announced that he was going to stand down at the 2014 election. So I was successful finally in winning pre-selection for that seat and went on to enter Parliament.
Displayed one of those characteristics of Calabresi, you know, that you don't give up very easily once you set your goal,
No.
which is some call it testadura, I call it more strength of will rather than testadura.
Yeah.
Because hearing your brain, I would have assumed that if you're going to go in politics on the left side rather than the Liberal side, what is motivated you to go Liberal rather than Labor side of politics?
Look, I'd have to say, I'd have to go back to my parent and the experience, and I hear what you say, and there's what drove events was that my parents had always instilled in us that sense of, if you can do it yourself, do it. So I've got this from my parents. I've inherited this sense of self-reliance, this drive to rely on my own initiative, and to some extent, it explains why I'm here. I'd also love to be a better delegator. I'm not, but that drive to achieve, not to accept or seek help when you don't need it, when you're perfectly capable. Now, I should say that's not an argument that says each woman or man to herself or himself. That's not what I'm about. It's more about if you are able-bodied and of able mind to do something, you need to do that, and you've got to have that drive, and that's where I get it from. And I've got to say, when I was in my teens, I did think about, well, what party best reflects who I am? And I had to think about that for some time, because I hadn't mixed in business circles. I hadn't mixed in circles where I dealt with people who had high profiles and had achieved great things in their lives. It was that are public, with a high profile, I mean by that. It had been a very sort of narrow experience, so I didn't have that. So you might think that that's where I might go, but certainly when I made my decision, I felt I'd made the right one.
Yeah. And in fact, the Latrobe Valley was highly unionised at that time, as my recollection is correct.
That's right.
And also, in terms of your father, did he have political leanings one way or the other, or was it again similar to yours, that he relied on himself and as much as he could?
You know, I don't think he did. It's funny, and I've tried to understand what a lot of that generation did, because they liked Menzies.
Yeah.
They liked Whitlam. They kind of liked Fraser, but not in the way they wanted to have a beer with him.
No.
They loved Hawke,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They loved Howard. My parents, so there's a kind of style of leadership. I think it's not a singular form of leadership, but they supported different people, and I think they liked the idea of success, strength, you know, that kind of resilience. I think it might be, and I don't know that I've ever quite divined why they, you know, supported leaders on different sides and flipped from Menzies to Whitlam to Hawke to, you know, so on and so forth. But it's definitely there, and I should throw Kennett into that as well. You know, same kind of thing.
Yeah. And it's also, I think, interesting because I think it's a reflection probably of the very individualistic traits that a lot of the Calabresi have, which is both a strength and a weakness, in the sense that we tend to want to do it on our own, and we tend to follow our own counsel to a lot of extent. But the downside to that is that it's very difficult to get collective action because of the same reason. And I say that because up until a few years ago, the Italians and the Calabresi and Sicilians within them were the largest non-Anglo-Celtic group in Australia. And if you look at the amount of political influence that the group had as a group, it didn't exist in reality. And if you compare our group to other minority groups, they perform much better. And I've never been able to get to the bottom of why that is so, other than to say, well, part of the problem is that we don't really aspire to act collectively, except on some special issues where, you know, a raw nerve is hit, and then we say, you know, look, we can't have this. What do you think about that? And why is it that we haven't collectively participated as much as perhaps we should have in the political process?
Geez, it's a fascinating question. You know where I've landed, because I hear what you're saying, and I've often thought about it, especially when I've spoken at Italian community events, particularly when I was Shadow HG. I think it's because we don't like to be bossed around. we got our own view. We no, you don't have to tell me what to do. I'm my own boss, kind of thing. There is an element of that in the Italian experience. So I've resolved in my own mind what this means. It means that being Italian is more about a state of mind than anything else. I can't explain it either, and it, to some extent, it has come at a price, because our links back to Italy, commercially, artistically, culturally, they're strong, but they're probably not as strong as they could be, right? And I think when you look at, say, some of the achievements of counterpart groups, say in the Greek or Jewish community, they've done it exceptionally well. And you're right. I think it is both a virtue and a vice, unfortunately.
Or look at the Vietnamese. What they've achieved in such a small time frame compared to our own. And as I say, good luck to them. But but it's an interesting fact, though, because in a way it has retarded community development, in my view. Although I think some would say, well, it's also a reflection that we Calabresi, Sicilians and others have blended better within the broader community and haven't had to rely on our own community to advance within the broader community. And I think there's an element of truth in that. And I think probably you're an example of one of those that's done precisely that you've gone out there within the broader society and you've succeeded.
I think that's right.
Terms, rather than because, you know, relying on the support of your own community.
I think that's right. And to give you one example, my parents, when they came out, I know they weren't alone, but it wasn't common, excuse me, the decision they took, but they decided that at home, they were going to speak English to us as kids growing up. So although my two older sisters know a good deal more Italian, and I knew a lot more when I was younger, as I moved away from home,
and probably do recall, in fact, the first Calabresi-born person to be elected to the Victorian Parliament, Giovanni Scroll, who gave his maiden speech in Italian, or partially in Italian. He also spoke in English. But at the time, my recollection of this, he was soundly criticised for having dared to speak in Italian in Parliament. And his justification is, well, that's who I am. But it was very, I think, at the time, very difficult for people to accept that. And although my own view is that Grove was a remarkable person in many ways and a trailblazer, but not many have really followed in that sense. And the question I want to ask: how many Italian politicians are there, for example, in Victoria? I know, Minister Lily D'Ambrosio she's also Calabresi, but I can't think of anyone else.
I'd have to do a rough count, but there wouldn't be many.
No.
There wouldn't be many. There's James Molino is another one. There are a couple with sort of a grandmother or a grandparent. So depending on how strict you want to be on the definitions, there'd be a handful. Not many at all. And some of them you have Italian backgrounds, but their names don't suggest it. So there wouldn't be more than 10, certainly not more than 10, if you broadened out that definition.
And one detrimental aspect of not having a larger number, obviously, is that there's less opportunity to have an input into the political decisions that are made and which affect not just us, but the broader community as well. Whereas other groups, from my observation, have that direct input into the political process because of their greater involvement. Would you agree with that? Or?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think what we were talking about before is another very big part, that the broader diaspora, how well organised is it? And can it attract the ear of governments, state and federal? So when you talk about trade delegations, when you talk about establishing overseas business offices, for example, is Italy on the table for discussion? Probably not in most cases. Because is there a loud clamour for it? Perhaps not. I mean, we've got now a business office that is representing Victoria's interests in South America. Now, I support that. You know, I don't think that's a bad idea at all to tie into our overall footprint in the Americas. But we don't have a lot going in Italy. We talk about it. It's all fun when we have local events, but we don't really have the footprint we should have in Italy and Europe in particular. And you think about the links, you know, the cultural links with Greece are stronger, but look at how small Greece is compared with Italy. And my argument is that our interactions at a more formal level with trade and cultural exchanges and the like is not nearly what it should be if it were commensurate with that, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I think it's at least 2 years ago, Italy was a very important trading partner for Australia in terms of Australia selling goods into Italy. Now, how do you think we could improve that? Is it establishing formal bodies, or is it individuals being more vocal about a need and how that should be satisfied? Because I think it's an important issue, because my own view is we can't allow it to continue going the way it has, but it's going to be difficult to reach agreement on the way that we should proceed. So I'd be interested on your take about that issue.
Yeah, look, it's a really broad area and important one. Interesting, you know, when you think about what countries have the greatest influence on Australian culture, fashion, tastes, you name it, probably the US sits at the top of that list, right? Culturally, the impact of the United States cultural issues does. But you think about the impact of Italy. Let's take Great Britain and Italy, for example. Now, historically, our institutions, our systems of government, thankfully comes from a system which I think was at its time the most enlightened in human history up at that point. So our parliament, our courts and the like. But culturally, artistically, in culinary senses, the impact of Italy is arguably greater. And yet, do we have that kind of structural relationship with Italy that we do with the United Kingdom? Not nearly, right? So I think when you go back to your question about how is this done, if I was starting with a blank sheet, what I would say, putting aside all the logistical difficulties and cultural dynamic, inter-organizational dynamics, you would probably start with a conference of all of the leading organizations in Australia that are dedicated in some way to promoting a relationship culturally, commercially with Italy, and looking at what everybody's doing and working towards some kind of, for the moment, let's call it a paper or a discussion or an issues paper, which looks at what we need to do and why and what the benefits are. Because when I go back to that issue of the cultural links, there are a few countries that could claim to exert that kind of influence on so many aspects of art and culture, commerce, as Italy does in so many ways. Think about all of the entities and product lines and things that try to assert some connection with Italy because they know it'll be more highly regarded. There does need to be a lot of work, and going back to that earlier thing, we kind of laughed about it a little, but it is true. trying to herd cats.
Yeah.
Every organisation wants to do its own thing, and even within those organisations, there are people who want to do things. But the opportunities to build on that are enormous. It's just that we've never really organised it. And what I think it needs to culminate in is a series of proposals to governments, federal and state, maybe even local, depending on the issues that come out, that give them, forgive the hackneyed phrase, but a kind of roadmap or a blueprint for, okay, this is what we want to do, this is why it's important to do. And it's not just dollars and cents. It's about what Italian culture mixed in and integrated with Australian culture, what it's done for not just our own respective countries, what it's done for the world. And that engages some big ideas and some big thinking. But it is possible. It just takes a hell of a lot of organisation, because I know there's a lot of groups, Italian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, which there's all these bodies around, but I think they've struggled to have an impact because they're all doing their own little thing. And I think it needs to be brought together. It doesn't mean you have to give up what you're doing necessarily, but you need to come together and produce something that has the power of that chorus behind it. Then governments will listen.
I've had for many years a vision of a umbrella body, if you like, that could be comprised of all of these associations and other bodies that are related to the Italian community, that can act in a unified way to actually advocate for those things that we've been discussing. But it's been very difficult to realise up until now, but hopefully, things will change and people will perceive the need for it.
And look, Vince, I think it's a long-term project. I don't think that anyone who goes into it thinking that it's going to be 6 months of work and then bang, the food is ready. It's not. But there are some things. Give you an example of one thing I've always wondered about, which would be one thing. So it's not everything, but one thing that would just kickstart a few other things on. Imagine you could get a Serie A team to purchase an A-League team, or develop a partnership with an A-League team. Let's say Inter Milan or AC Milan, for want of a better example. If they came in and did what Manchester City did. Now, I know it's one small part. It's, there's a whole billion other things we've got to do.
Sure.
But you ask about what little things can be a catalyst for other things. All of a sudden you've got, imagine that exchange. And I'm not just talking the relationship between the two clubs, if you could do that, but imagine all of the offshoots. You would have delegations coming and going. You'd have not just the petty things like the merchandising and stuff, but you could build things off that relationship. And that's just one thing. That's in sport, soccer. But you could do it in other areas, culture and fashion and the like. We can do these things, but the key is not to think that we can do everything at once. Pick off a few things and make them happen.
Yeah. Good. Well, I hope that we will be able to build such a structure. Just to move on, you were Attorney General for 4 years.
Shadow Attorney General.
Oh.
Sorry, I was a Shadow Attorney General, sorry.
And you lost your seat at the last election. Without intruding, it must have been a devastating experience.
Yeah, it was. It's not something I had worked my whole adult life for, and I can only say in my defence that I had worked my seat, always treating it as a gift and, treating it like a marginal seat. It wasn't on paper, but I'd always worked it. I'd expected and hoped that my career could advance as I went beyond that election with, other opportunities that might come up after that. I knew we weren't probably going to win in 2018. There was a hope, like a lot of us had, that we might get there, but the overwhelming view from most people was that we'd claw back a few seats, but we might not make it. So I was looking beyond the election at what kind of role I could play. We also had the disaster of what was the federal shenanigans in 2018. So when we went to the election, we were going right when people were just furious with the Liberal brand at that time. That would ultimately change over the course of 2019, but in the month up to the state election in 2018, it was pretty toxic and it was pretty tough. I, was surprised at the depth of that, but it was pretty tough.
I can imagine. But perhaps the result is also a reflection of the electorates and the voters being dissatisfied with both parties, because here in Victoria, we've got a very large number of independents in Parliament, haven't we? Which was never really the case in the past. It was either one or the other, one or two independents. But I think at the moment there's about 11 independents in the upper house alone.
Yeah, that's right. In the lower house, we've got 2 or 3.
Yeah.
In the lower house from memory. So independents are a modern phenomenon, and in state politics, it's even more of a phenomenon than it is at a federal level, because it is typically harder at a federal level to be an independent. It's not impossible, as we've seen, but it's not as common. At state level, it is much more common. So the major parties have to be on notice about this. But in 2018, the leadership division at the federal level just killed us, even at a state level. So there's not a lot you can do. But equally, Vincent, you could look at what Labor achieved in 2018 and say, well, look, a major party can still do well.
Yeah.
So they picked up an enormous number of seats in 2018 as well.
Well, which really leads to the question: was it a reaction to, well, not just the debacle in the leadership federally, but maybe also the policies that were being offered by the Liberal Party at that time? And many in the electorate thought, well, we don't want it. And rather than vote Labor, they voted independent, and certainly in the upper house.
Yeah, look, I think that's a perfectly fair question. What I'd say is that at any election, you've got to make sure, if you want to succeed as a party, that you're speaking to the issues that people actually have at the top of their lists. And I think what 2018 is an example of, and I said this on the night, and I've said it since, that I don't think that we had captured that list in the order that most people had it. So for most people, what was important was, what's your idea for building our state? Roads, public transport, schools, hospitals. That's what they were. That was front and center for most people. Were we talking about that? Not as much as we should have. We had some ideas. In fact, we had some of the best ideas going around, but I just don't think, sadly for us, that we put that before the Victorian people and gave them the choice they really deserve. So, we had a great idea, for example, on regional fast rail. It was costed. It was really sensible. It'll need to be done at some point. It was our idea, but we left it until October to announce it. So, we had a great idea on an issue that really tapped into what people were feeling, and it answered a whole lot of issues, not just for regional Victoria, but for population pressures in Melbourne. It answered a whole lot of questions, but we left it till the very end. And did we have enough time to sell it? No. So, as long as we learn that lesson and stay alert to that lesson, we've got every chance, my side anyway, of winning in 2022.
Yeah. And I've got to ask you, presumably you're going to run again at the next election?
Yeah, look, I want to put my hand up, Vincent. Yeah. I want to give it another go. Strangely, the strangest thing happened after losing the election. Rarely a day goes by where I'm not getting stopped or messaged by email or phone or on social media from somebody saying, I hope you're going to run again. Just not long before this, I had one of your colleagues at the bar send me something really quite touching to say, I really hope you're going to run again. So you get this encouragement. And, I've been around politics a long time, so I've seen people lose and go, but it's just not my nature. And I knew, as tough as it was to wake up on the 25th of November 2018 and realise, hey, I don't think I'm going to be able to hold this seat the way it's going. I knew then that I'm going to try again. It's just in our nature, as you said before, we keep trying and we keep fighting.
Well,
That's the Calabresi way, Vince.
you shouldn't give up, and you should keep trying. Look, it's another 2 years, and I know that is a long time, but I think that the mood of the electorate in Hawthorn will probably change compared to what it was last time, and people will probably revert to the thinking that saw Baillieu hold a seat for a fair number of years, albeit, as you say, it wasn't a really safe seat, but nevertheless, it was a Liberal seat. And if that's your ambition, I think you should stick with it, because I think that's got good prospects. The final topic I want to raise with you is really the current situation, because, and I don't want to talk specifically about Corona, but the pandemic has brought a lot of hardship, but in a way, it also presents the governments at both state and federal level with an unprecedented opportunity, in the sense that, maybe at a federal level and the state level, they should be thinking of whether it's feasible to reclaim some of the manufacturing base that Australia gave up, partially because of the consequences of globalisation, and partially because of the perceived excessive labour costs in Australia. So that I think it's important, and I don't know what the federal budget will actually provide, but in a way, it may be better to spend money creating infrastructure that will provide jobs, rather than paying half wages for prospective tradesmen as apprentices, where there may not be a job at the end of their training. What do you think? Do you see any opportunities, in fact, that have been offered as a consequence of the economic and social situation that the pandemic has created?
Certainly, and it's pleasing to see, because what the pandemic obviously showed and revealed to us in very stark terms is that when global supply chains come to a halt, you better have a manufacturing capacity. So it's not just about comparative advantage. We've all seen over recent decades that the theory of comparative advantage is that countries will exercise their competitive edge to produce products and supply them to the world. That makes sense, and to a degree, even despite COVID, I still believe in that theory. But what COVID's telling us is it's not the be all and end all. That theory has to be tempered by reality. So at the federal level, they get this, I think, and even last week, they dropped an early budget announcement that they're going to invest about $2 billion in targeted assistance to particular areas of manufacturing, from recycling and clean energy to medicines and the like. So federal government's getting it. I think the state governments are getting it, ours included. Even the oppositions are getting it quite clearly. I know Michael O'Brien down here's done it too. So to be fair to all parties and all levels, I think there is a stark realization that we need to be resilient as a country, as all countries do. It's not just us. When global supply chains can be broken up so instantly as they were, you do need that. So does the theory of comparative advantage and free trade support that? No. The theory talks about something quite opposite. But what the theory doesn't have to live with is it doesn't have to live with the pandemic, right? It can afford to theorize under lab conditions. Well, we don't live under lab conditions. So I agree with you. I think this has been an opportunity to look at, okay, well, Victoria in particular was the heart, and still is to some extent the heart of manufacturing in Australia. It can restore itself to that preeminent role even more, and that does have to be taken up in a big way. We can't have ourselves exposed in this way in the future again.
Absolutely. If the pandemic shows anything, it is that being self-dependent is crucial to survival, basically. Otherwise, what are you going to do? And so hopefully whoever is in government will follow that, and hopefully will utilise what I consider to be our natural advantages in terms of the resources that are here, so that instead of transporting everything overseas and then importing the finished product, we might actually export the finished product overseas, and they can buy it from us rather than we buying it from them. But that remains to be seen.
I agree with that.
Yeah. All right.
Certainly agree with that.
Okay. Well, John, well, I should have said at the beginning to make it clear that you are, in fact, the patron of our association, and we're very glad that you accepted the position, and we're very glad that you've made yourself available. And I think that those people that watched the interview will be enlightened to a great extent. And clearly, we wish you all the best in your political pursuits. And again, thanks
Thank you,
very
Vince.
much. Okay.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you to everyone
Thanks,
involved.
John. Thanks. Okay.
Thanks.